Good afternoon, everyone. Please join me in welcoming our webcast viewers. My name is Fred Mifflin, President of the Canadian Club of Toronto, and your host today. Viewers, thank you for joining us. We're proud of our club's track record of providing a forum for political, business, and cultural leaders to share their ideas with us and to challenge our thinking. Today's guests are great examples. Before I formally introduce them, let me tell you about some of our upcoming events. Next Thursday, June 1st, Evan Siddall, President and CEO of CMHC, will be here to discuss Canada's national housing strategy. And on Thursday, June 9th, Bill Down, President and CEO of BMO Financial Group, will be at our podium as part of our Global Leaders Series as the bank celebrates its 200th anniversary. To order your tickets or to learn more about the club, please visit our website at canadianclub.org. You can also join the conversation via Twitter and Instagram by following us at CDNCLUBTO or by using that hashtag. I want to express special thanks to today's event sponsors, CIBC, represented by Brent Reuter, and Vice Rise, represented by Michael Cronish. Thank you both for your generous support. And now our guest speakers. Addressing the historic and entrenched system of neglect of Canada's First Nations people is the focus of considerable attention. It is no coincidence that as Canada turns 150, addressing past wrongs is high atop political, institutional, and community agendas across the land. Today, we're honored to have National Chief Perry Bellegarde and CBC radio host Duncan McHugh discuss reconciliation from their unique perspectives. The Assembly of First Nations, our country's foremost national Aboriginal advocacy organization, has benefited from a succession of dynamic and passionate leaders. The Assembly's 11th National Chief, Perry Bellegarde, fits this description aptly. He was named National Chief in December 2014. Known for his ability to build consensus, he brings people, leaders, elders, and healers together to advance First Nations issues. He's held the roles of Councillor, Chief, Tribal Chair, Chief of the Federation of Saskatchewan Indian Nations, and Assembly of First Nations Regional Chief for Saskatchewan. Joining Chief Bellegarde is Duncan McHugh. The host of CBC Radio's Cross Country Checkup is a well-respected journalist who has been widely acknowledged for shining a bright light on Aboriginal issues. He was part of a CBC Aboriginal investigation into missing and murdered Indigenous women that won numerous awards. He's also an adjunct professor in the UBC journalism program and was recently awarded an Inspire Award for Public Service, recognized for his contribution to journalism and journalism education. As I mentioned earlier, if you have any questions or comments, please fill out one of the Q&A cards on your tables, and one of our staff will collect them. Chief Bellegarde and Duncan, a warm welcome to you both. The Canadian Club of Toronto's podium is yours. Good job. Thanks very much.
I was just going to jump up, but Perry was worried he was going to hurt himself.
Oh, I can still get into that hockey arena.
This is fun. I'm excited. But why did you want to do a fireside chat rather than the old just get up at the podium and give a speech?
I think it was more just more low-key, more relaxed, more informative. I've done the speech here many, many times from this podium, and I thought we got a really robust, exciting crowd here. Let's just talk.
Cool. And we've got a nice little fire here crackling away. It smells.
Fred's putting the logs on.
It's all good.
Putting the logs on. So I can see it.
I was told that when I sit with the illustrious chief that I have to bring gifts. So I wanted to present you with this. It's a cross-country checkup magnet. CBC, you know, I mean.
And And I was introduced as a lobbyist or advocate. I wonder if CBC is doing any of that right now.
But here's the thing. This is a special edition cross-country checkup magnet. It comes from our show in the Membertou First Nation.
Ah, yeah.
And at the bottom there, it says cross-country
In
checkup
Mi'kmaq.
in Mi'kmaq. So can
Yeah.
you read that out loud for our audience?
All right. Asugmus tumuk tan telemiliak.
Not bad for a Cree. Well done.
Yeah.
Now, they mentioned those little cards and all the little pens that you got on your tables. I figure this is kind of like a Canadian Club checkup. So really, if you have questions for Perry, I would love to work them in, because otherwise I have to sit here and ask questions for 45 minutes, and I'll have to make him cry. So if you have questions, really write them down. We'll have people collecting them, and I'd love to work them into the conversation, and I'm quite genuine about that. That's part of my gig every Sunday, so it's all good. I want to start just by taking your pulse, because we're supposed to be here talking about reconciliation, and because it's all about me. We in the media industry had a bit of a rough week this past week when it comes to Indigenous issues and the prize that shall not be named. But I had a lot of people come up to me afterwards and talk about that they feel that there's a different mood in the air. So there was the appropriation prize came up. No, it wasn't pleasant, but then there was an awful lot of people who came forward afterwards and stood up and said, no, that's not the Canadian media that we want to be. That's not the Canada we want to be. There was the Emerging Indigenous Writers Prize was a crowd-funded effort that's now raised, I think, $85,000, $90,000. A lot of Canadians standing up and saying, no, that's not the Canada we want. And I've had people saying that there's something in the air, that reconciliation seems to be happening. I'm wondering if you're sensing that.
I'm going to say yes, it's starting to move, but I'm going to always say not quickly enough. Like even before I begin, I have to say ninashkamun. Nista pikskrid ne hewan. Kinanaskum tenu akaki ono temtek no aku maganak. Egwa ogi mau kinaskum tin Mississauga's new credit naskum tin. Egwa conference or the Toronto club tapwe miasik Fred ninaskum tin. You know, no tawinan smantu kinaskum tin and Nakota hometakia pi pinamaya. I just wanted to do that first, just to get that protocol out of the way. Speaking a little bit in Cree and a little bit in Assiniboine, Nakota, acknowledging that I'm very happy to be here, acknowledging the traditional ancestral lands, Mississauga's new credit, Chief Laforme, and as well the leadership here, the big chief here, I'll say, Chairman Ms. Mifflin here, and to the club to bring everybody together. And I acknowledge the creator, Notawinan Simantu, Aran Nakota Tokashla. So that done. Now to the question of reconciliation. And there's whole things from cultural appropriation to the children dying in the river at Thunder Bay to missing emergencies women. There's so much things going on in Canada that you see right now. And I was asked, well, when do you think it's ever going to happen, reconciliation? When do you think it's going to move? And I said it this way, well, you know, when there are no more people being found dead in rivers, that's reconciliation. When there are no more 5 to 7 times the national average suicide rates for our young people, that's reconciliation. When there's no more caps on post-secondary education, that's reconciliation. When there's no more of our people filling up the jails, we're 4.5% of Canada's population, but 70-80% of the jails are filled by Indigenous peoples. When there's no more of that, when there's no more 40,000 First Nations children in foster care, that would be a form of reconciliation. When we're no longer shut out from the economy, you know, and set aside from the land and the resource development, that's economic reconciliation. When we can partner with industry, both public and private sector, that's reconciliation. When we can teach our children to embrace the diversity here in Canada, to respect all languages, all cultures, including the Mississaugas and Ukraine, including the Haudenosaunee, the Ongwahoe peoples, including the Nehewak peoples, the Anishinaabe peoples, the Mi'kmaq people, the Coast Salish people. We have 58 different tribes. So even embracing the concept that Canada founded just on this beautiful English language, and mais oui, je parle français un petit peu. Mes amis, bienvenue tout le monde. Vous êtes très important à mes yeux. Not bad, huh? That's reconciliation, you know, so it's starting. It's starting, but we got to move it up and kick it up a notch. And that's why I always take the time and I ask myself, why am I coming to this club in Toronto? You know, why am I coming here? It's to create partnerships, to create networks, build relationships, because you can all help. Like, I want you all to help us in this reconciliation path. Because when governments invest, at first, 2 years ago, it was $8.4 billion. Last year, it was $3.4 billion on First Nations people in the federal budget. That's a good thing. That's a good thing. I want you all to say that's a good thing because Canada's 6th quality life, Indigenous peoples were 63rd when you apply the same indices to our people. So maintaining this 6th versus 63rd gap is not in the best interests of this country called Canada. And if we can start closing that gap, that's good. And it means long-term sustainable investments. And it means constant investments every year, every fiscal year, every federal budget year, until that gap starts closing. Then we can see reconciliation. You know, and then even the dialogue, Duncan, about telling the truth. Telling the truth. Just acknowledge, and it's not to, I'm not going to tell the truth, Fred, to make you feel guilty about what your grandfather and great-grandfather and great-great-grandfather has done to Indigenous peoples, but we know the truth. Let's talk about the truth and just expose it, learn from it, and then move on. Creating a better environment in this country for our children and grandchildren. But you can't deny the truth. You know, and that's, to me, is reconciliation.
The reason I ask about this period of time that we're in is that I think back to being in a similar period of time around 1990, after the Oka crisis, after with the Charlottetown Accord, and there was a great deal of interest in the concerns of Indigenous people at that time, and a lot of interest in trying to make change. I wonder if this time that we're in now is any different, if there will be change. Or if we're flavor of the month at the moment, and we'll move on.
Well, I like to, not to quote Shrek, but I'm going to. Shrek said it best. Change is good, donkey. and change is good. You know, from the Hawthorne report, to the Penner report, to the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples report, to now the 94 calls to action, the TR4, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's 94 calls to action. You got 4 very good reports. Go back and research the Hawthorne report and the Penner report, you know, and the RCAP report, which resulted from the Oka crisis. And now we have the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, 94 calls to action. And we've always said that these reports are good, but if they're not implemented, they're just gathering dust. They're just a waste of energy and time. $60 million for the RCAP report. $60 million coming up with those recommendations from the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples from the Oka crisis. How many were implemented? And now we've got the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, 94 calls to action. And so I say, yes, Duncan, things are changed because, and I'm not a conservative or a liberal or NDP or Green. The only card I carry is a status card right now, right? It's the only card I carry, and they get that because of the Indian Act. You know, so I'm an advocate. I've got to work with whoever gets elected. And I got to work with all the leaders of all the opposition parties and everybody. I've got to reach out to everybody. And so what I see with the change from conservative to liberal government, there was a light, a change. I'm going to be honest, but I'm not liberal, but I'm saying there was a change. And so now it's my job as national chief to hold Prime Minister Trudeau and Cabinet and all the 183 MPs' feet to the fire about what they said. And they said, all 93 calls to action will be honored and implemented. That's a good thing. So I see a new way of doing business now. There's more collaboration. There's more cooperation. And I see an opportunity now, like for us as First Nations people, Indigenous peoples, the ball's here. And as National Chief, I sure as heck don't want to drop that ball. Because whenever I'm done, I want to make sure that I move this ball down that football field and moved it a little further ahead so I can hand it off to the next national chief when I'm done. And that we've made a difference. And that gap, 6th versus 63rd, is starting to close, right? And so I see an opportunity now, working with this Liberal government, and Adam Vaughan is here. You know, he's part of the 183. You know, so it's constantly working with them all. But not just them. You know, Ron Ambrose did a good job and leader of the Conservative. You know, I got to deal with the NDP. I got to deal with all of them. And so I see that opportunity now for policy and legislative change, you know, for MMIW, all these things I see happening.
So I want to get into some of the nitty-gritty of reconciliation and what it means in terms of your relationship with the federal government and the AFN's relation. But I went back into to when you were elected. So that was December of 2014.
2014.
Let me read what you said on that day when you won.
I was pumped.
Business as usual. Yeah, I can tell. Business as usual, that is not on. First Nations people will oppose any development which deprives our children of legacy of our ancestors. If our lands and resources are to be developed, it will be done on our terms and timeline. That was in your victory speech.
That's it.
How's that going?
It's starting. It's almost like in the message to the audience here and people watching in terms of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, free, prior, and informed consent, in terms of the duty to consult and accommodate, you know, in terms of resource development. And I always say we balance things. We want to find balance as First Nations people. The economy and the environment, the economy. We're always going to search for that sweet spot between the two, because what we've seen over the years that we've been excluded from the economy. I'm going to say that very respectfully. We've been excluded, not allowed to participate fully in the economy. And then all the resources from Canada, you know, and there's lots of resources, billions of resources. You know, whether you're talking about the Ring of Fire in Northern Ontario, whether you're talking about uranium in Northern Saskatchewan or potash in Southern Saskatchewan, whether you're talking about softwood lumber in British Columbia, there's a lot of natural resources. And this thing called GDP, gross domestic product, is generated from the land and resource wealth. And so for First Nations people, Indigenous peoples, we have not been participating fully in that economy because we've been excluded. And so when we see Indigenous people say, well, holy smokes, truckloads of lumber going out of my traditional lands and territory, we don't have no jobs, we have no revenue sharing, we have nothing coming back. You apply that to every industry resource sector. That's what we see happening. And so now we've got to switch that. And so we find the balance between the economy and the environment, because we want sustainable economic development strategies in full partnership with First Nations people. You know, and this whole thing called FPIC, free, prior, and informed consent, it's the ability to bring public and private sector together, federal, provincial governments, and First Nations governments together, and map things out before you try to build anything. And that was what I meant in my words. Because even now, I'm using this word called assumed crown sovereignty and assumed crown jurisdiction. And I say that with most respect and great respect, because there's a challenge now in a respectful way about this thing called the doctrine of discovery, and even this concept of terra nullius, vacant land. You know, so how did the Crown gain title to the land and the territory and the resources? It was via that animal called the doctrine of discovery. And so in a respectful way, we have to say, is that indeed the truth? Because we believe it isn't. Because now in the global community, in the international community, that's becoming viewed as an illegal and racist doctrine. And it is. And so now that's going to have an impact. It's all about, when Chief Stace used the word treaty, we have many kinds of treaties in Canada. We have the Turo Wampum Treaty. We have the pre-Confederation treaties. We have the number treaties, where I'm from. And we have treaties amongst ourselves as Indigenous peoples as well. But that treaty relationship was all about sharing the land and resource wealth, mutually benefiting from the land and resource wealth. But we don't see that happening, because we still see, we're 63rd, remember? Canada's up here. And so we have to find creative ways to build partnerships with industry so that we can look at mutually benefiting from the resource wealth that's there. So it's that line that you said, Duncan, is from that speech, because I wanted to stir the pot a bit. And whether you're talking about pipelines, whether you're talking about industry development, whatever industry there is, you've got to find a new way of doing business. And to all the CEOs in the room, ask yourselves, do you have an Indigenous engagement strategy and plan? Do you have a representative workforce strategy? Do you have a procurement strategy? And I always say, how many Indigenous people are on your board of directors? How many Indigenous people in senior management? So I want to see Indigenous peoples around senior decision-making table. Wherever decisions are being made, we got to get Indigenous peoples there. You're going to have diversity, but you're going to get really good, robust dialogue and discussions on policy and developments and strategy, and you're going to come up with a really good end product. That's what I'm going to encourage everybody to do, whatever organization you're from here. And that, to me, is all from that one statement.
You mentioned free, prior, informed consent. And so if we look at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission recommended that Canada needed to adopt the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, that phrase is the heart of UNDRIP, free, prior, informed consent. And Canada has gone to the United Nations and said, we now, our reservations about UNDRIP, we have them no more. We adopt UNDRIP. But then on the other hand, we've also heard from the Justice Minister, Jody Wilson-Raybould, who has said that UNDRIP is in many ways unworkable in terms of trying to implement it, right? She said that to the chief.
Last July, a couple of years ago.
So let me ask you about that notion of free and prior informed consent. What does that mean to you as the head of the AFN?
Okay, a couple of points. Since Minister Raybould has come to the Chiefs Assembly right after a couple of years back, there's been a change in attitude, there's been a change in messaging, there's been a change in communications, that it is now workable, to look at ways that you can adopt this international covenant, this UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples within this nation state called Canada, within the confines of the Constitution of Canada, Section 35, which states existing Aboriginal treaty rights are recognized and affirmed. So it is possible to look at ways of implementing that now. But the most important clause within the UN Declaration is not just free, prior, informed consent, Duncan. I would argue the most important clause is the one that refers to self-determination. Self-determination for Indigenous peoples. And as Indigenous peoples, we have our own languages, we have our own lands, we have our own laws, our own identifiable people, and our own identifiable forms of government. 5 elements for that inherent right to self-determination to be recognized globally. And so when we have that right, I've always said it's the right to say yes, or the right to say no. That's what it is. And we have a mixture now across Canada. Some chiefs and councils want to support this initiative, whether you're talking about oil and gas developments or pipelines. Some do not want it. So we have that divergent opinion. So I come back to the point about following and trying to find that sweet spot between the economy and the environment, always respecting that inherent right to self-determination as Indigenous peoples, working towards the balance between the economy and the environment. And free, prior, informed consent basically means, before you build anything as industry or governments, first build a respectful relationship and a respectful dialogue with the Indigenous peoples, the rights and title holders. That's the most important thing. So I'm going to put words like veto on the shelf, words like that, because they're not mentioned in the Chilcotin decision, the Williams case, Supreme Court of Canada decision. But duty to consult and accommodate is, right? Even within the UN Declaration, veto is not mentioned, but free, prior, and informed consent is. It's the ability to bring people together to create that dialogue and find common ground before you put a shovel in the ground. And to me, that's going to create economic stability and economic certainty. And so I've asked not only the federal government to do that, but I've asked each of the premiers to do the same thing, to find ways and means to look at implementation of the UN Declaration. And I've lifted up Rachel Notley 2 years ago. When we meet with them, with the premiers, we get to meet with them annually, because she was the first premier to say and give instructions to her cabinet, go out now, go forth and go hither and come back with a plan and strategy and how this can be implemented within your departments as ministers. And she wants that plan back. So that was one provincial government. But that can happen 10, 13 times over. So it's federal, provincial government. So that's what that means to me, when free, prior, informed consent. We don't want to create economic instability, but we want the relationship.
But you say, okay, put veto on the shelf for a second, but let me press you a little bit.
Press away.
The Trudeau government has approved, let's say, the Kinder Morgan pipeline, the Trans Mountain pipeline running from Alberta into British Columbia. There are a number of First Nations along the line which have expressed concerns. The Tsleil-Waututh Nation, which is in the port of Vancouver, has refused to be part of the process, the NEB consultation process, because they say it's a flawed process from the beginning. It does not satisfy consultation. From your understanding of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, should the objections of a group like the Tsleil-Waututh or other First Nations along the line be recognized as part of their rights in their territories? Is it part of their self-determining rights, and therefore is Canada ignoring their rights?
Yes, on one hand, and then no on the other hand. Because you also have First Nations people that support Kinder Morgan on the other hand. You have Tsleil-Waututh at the end, where it's going to come out, that says no to it. So, again, you're going to have 128 First Nations. In Canada, you've got 634 First Nations. Does everybody have a good understanding of everybody in the room? Nod your heads or no? I'll take 30 seconds to describe something here to you. Well, there's 634 First Nations across Canada, right? You got 203 in British Columbia, 203 chiefs. Alberta, you've got 47. Saskatchewan, you got 74. Manitoba, you got 66. In Ontario here, you got 134. Quebec, you got 42. On the East Coast, the eastern provinces, there's 33. Up north in the Yukon, there's 14. And in the Northwest Territories, there's 28. Out of those 634 First Nations, there's 58 different tribes or nations. There are Ojibwe, there's Mi'kmaq, there's Maliseet, there's Nehiyawak peoples, there's Mississaugas, there's Mohawk, there's Coast Salish, there's 58 different tribes. So there's much diversity. And along those lines, when you talk about pipelines or any other development, there's some that are very pro-pipeline. And then there's some that aren't. So again, as National Chief, I'm not the rights and title holder. AFN's not the rights and title holder. We're an advocacy organization. We're united in that sense. And I'm empowered by the 634 chiefs to speak on their behalf. So I got some that say yes, some that say no. So I'm walking this fine line. Because the right to say yes, the right to say no. So I support Tsleil-Waututh, but I also support the Mikisew Cree. I'm supporting because it's balance. And so we're trying to bring everybody together to find that common ground if we can. Even to start moving globally now. This is my personal viewpoint now. Globally, I think as people, we're just too dependent on fossil fuels. We're just too dependent. So there's got to be a transition plan and a transition phase to move to renewable energy. And there's lots of money, and there's lots of jobs with renewable energy as well. Solar, wind, geothermal, like there's so much over here. But we've been so ingrained because we all drive cars, we all fly planes, we all drive trucks. Where's the plan to move away from our dependency as a society and moving towards clean energy? Because climate change is real, ladies and gentlemen. It's not fake news. The scientists aren't wrong. And so we've got a responsibility as human beings. And I'm going to get into my worldview at the end. Indigenous worldview, if we can incorporate Indigenous worldview, will make so much sense. But this whole piece, and we can't turn off the taps overnight. So there has to be a transition plan, a phase, and supporting climate change strategies, renewable energy strategies. And so that's my thoughts on that, moving towards that. And I think we'll be better off in the long term.
I've got a really important question. It's for our live stream audience who are admiring your shirt. Who made your shirt?
Tammy Bove. Okay. Plug for Tammy. Here's a shout out to Tammy Bove. He's a great designer. And we have a lot of Indigenous designers.
Where's Tammy from?
Where's she from, sweetie? Kahnawake.
Okay. Shout out to Tammy.
From Kahnawake.
It's a gorgeous shirt. I can't take my eyes off of it. We've got a great question here from the audience. What is the AFN planning to get more education funding from the government and other private sector funders so our next 7 generations get access to further opportunities? What's going on with education?
Lobby. Efforts, advocacy. This past year, you'll see the $90 million for post-secondary education funding, right? So that's $45 million a year because we had 10,000 students on the post-secondary student wait list. And we've always said there's no better way out of poverty than a good education. There is no better way out of poverty than a good education. So that means K to 12. So you got to have proper schools, proper resources in the schools. You know, math and science, computer science labs, the whole STEM piece, science, technology, engineering, math have to be a greater focus on that. So the schools are there from K to 12. But then you also have post-secondary. And so that's where, again, that 90 million in the federal budget comes from. Last year's federal budget announcement, right? So that's $45 million a year. And that's to deal with the backlog of students on the post-secondary student wait list. And so that's the efforts that we go through. I go through a painstaking lobby effort every fiscal year to try to influence that Sunya Ogimao. That Sunya Ogimao in Cree means big money chief. That's Morneau, Bill Morneau. That's what we call him. That's what I call him, Sunya Ogimao. He's the money chief. He's the director of finance. He's the minister of finance that has to put the federal budget together. So I basically go to every minister. What are your priorities in your ministry department? What are you asking for, Minister Bennett? Priorities within INAC. It's got to be housing, O&M, band support funding, education investments. That's one piece. You know, and then you hammer on the inside, Minister Bennett, and I'll hammer on the outside to the Sunya Ogimao. Then I'll go to ESDC, Minister Haidu, skills and training. You know, the assets program. We need more investments there because that deals with not only skills training, but also deals with on-reserve daycare, our children, our little ones. Proper investments there. Hammer away on the inside. I'll hammer away on the outside. And the same thing with Jane Philpott on health. Non-insured health benefits, transportation, youth suicides, national mental health strategy. She's got to get some money in her department to deal with that. Push it on the inside. I'll push it on the outside. Policing, Ralph Goodell. The policing program's got to be fixed. Hammer on the inside. Same thing we do on the outside. So that's how we do it. That's how I'm advocating. So it's influencing the federal budget cycle every fiscal year. And then to the people, we tell our young people, we walk in both worlds as Indigenous people. So equally important, and our old people used to go two hands, they used to go like this. Egwa no sum tu. Egwa. This one over here. Very important. Your K to 12, math and science, technical vocational skills training, all the above. Equally important is this one. Hey, what's this one? This one is your languages and your ceremonies and your traditions. Who you are as an Indigenous person. Equally as important to this one. So we have to combine both to our young men and women. And if they're watching, that's how we have to coexist. We foot in both worlds. Because this one, there's that pride in who you are and where you come from. Even studies have shown that when you're fluent in your language, when you're fluent, you're more successful in school, and you're therefore more successful in life. So Indigenous language identity is key. And that's one of the big pushes where I want you all to help push Prime Minister Trudeau and Minister Joly, get behind that Indigenous Language Revitalization Act and put millions of dollars behind it, because that's an investment in human capital. So even that. So that's what we're doing in education.
So I want to ask you about the Languages Act, but to the young student who's going to an on-reserve school right now, who has a teacher that is underpaid because reserve schools are getting 75, 80 cents on the dollar compared to provincial schools, who is not feeling the hope necessarily. Your predecessor tried very hard to get sweeping legislation that would impact on reserve schools and curriculum for kids, Native kids that were going to school off reserve. Is that kind of conversation that you're having right now with a new government about bringing in broad First Nations education legislation?
Not so much on education legislation yet. We're going to focus on two pieces of legislation before this next federal government election coming up on October 19th of 2018, I think it is. Is it 2018 or 2019? 2019. So within a couple of years, and everything, you should all know the political process. The last year, things are going to slow down. So if you want legislation, you got to get it done within the next year and a half. So I'm going to focus on legislation on languages, Indigenous Languages Revitalization Act, or whatever we're going to call it, and legislation to implement the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Okay? The process of education now, and so people that don't know, on-reserve schools get $6,500 approximate per tuition per child. In the provincial school systems, they get $11,000, $12,000 per child in the provincial school system. So $6,500 per child, $12,000 per child. And then in the French school system, they get almost $20,000 per child. That's the range, tuition per child. So we've had to fix this on-reserve tuition per child, which is why I gained the lobby effort through Minister Bennett in getting more resources into her department. Because if she doesn't get more resources in her department, she can't flow them out to the reserves, to the schools. So that's the process we're trying to engage in. That's where that $8.4 billion comes from a couple of years ago. The issue is big amount of money, but we got to get the bureaucracy, the good Department of Indian and Northern Affairs Canada, caught up with the vision of the cabinet, which is huge, good vision. But the bureaucracy is still narrow-minded, doing business the same old way. And that's what we've got to find, more effective and efficient policies and programs to change this bureaucracy and get those dollars out sooner in a more effective and efficient way, so those teachers, so the students that are watching, that those teachers' salaries are comparable to the salaries that you get in provincial school system, so that those schools on reserve get the same kind of resources in math and science and computer science labs as everybody else does. That's what we're trying to keep pushing for. So those resources may be there. We got to get them out of the bureaucracy, out to the communities, so they have meaningful, real impact. And again, I just go with that gap. The gap will start to close. That's how I see it.
Unfortunately, I'm told I've only got a minute left. Fred has not been putting wood on our fire here. It's starting to dwindle. I'm getting cold. But so I just want to end on one note. We are in Toronto, and very soon it's going to be the North American Indigenous Games.
Yes.
I'm wondering if you could tell me how excited you are about that, and do you have a favorite sport?
I'm very excited about the North American Indigenous Games. It's a chance to bring our young men and women from across Canada together to excel. And it's a time to shine here. And I'm going to be supporting that for sure here. In terms of a sport, I always say, back home in Saskatchewan, we had the Saskatchewan Indian Summer Games, Saskatchewan Indian Winter Games. If it wasn't for those things that were organized by Tony Cody, who's still alive, he's a Korean veteran, 1974-75, I was 15 years old. First time ever I got to leave Little Black Bear Reserve. First time ever. And I got to see Dave Hennique, who was a national chief, Iona Campanola, Noel Starblanket, and I was 15 years old, and I thought, oh, there's great leaders in there. Boy, they talk long on the stage. I thought, I never want to talk long on the stage as national chief. But the importance of sports, culture, and recreation, it brings our people together. And it's a good avenue to showcase. In terms of sports, for me, I play hockey. I still play hockey. I don't call it old-timers anymore. I call it senior pro.
Rusty Blades.
Yeah. So hockey, I play fastball, I play squash. I used to run marathons till my right knee gave out on me. It's important. It's important. And I think those are important games. And I encourage everybody to keep supporting those games.
Jimmy Gwitch, thank you very much, National Chief.
Okay. You good, Fred? Can I take 30 seconds? just quickly. I mentioned earlier on about our Indigenous worldview. And I wanted to leave you with that. Because it's if we can incorporate this worldview into what we do publicly and privately, in our own personal lives, but even in the public and private sector. Because in our worldview, like we see no color, we say. Because this is Sundance season coming up. The Mother Earth is waking up. The green leaves are out, right? The big lodges are going to be coming up. But we're the two-legged tribe here. We're the two-leggeds. So when we go to ceremony and we look at everything, our grandfathers and our spirit keepers will also acknowledge, of course, the Creator. There's only one Creator. You might know Him as God, Kisimantu, however you know the Creator. And then there's four thunder beings, east, south, west, north. We acknowledge them for the work they do. We also acknowledge Mother Earth. She gives us life. We also acknowledge Father Sky, Grandmother Moon, Grandfather Sun. We'll also acknowledge our relatives, the four-leggeds. We'll also acknowledge our relatives, the ones that fly, the ones that swim, the ones that crawl. We'll acknowledge the male plants, the female plants, and then very importantly, we'll acknowledge those four grandmother spirits that look after the rainwater, the fresh water, the salt water, and then the water that breaks when life comes. There's four grandmother spirits. So in our ceremony, when you have that worldview, when we say, Kakiao na wako magnak, all my relatives, we're all related. We're all connected. We're all part of that web. And if we can incorporate that into your being, into your way of thinking, we'll have a great world for our children and grandchildren. And that's what I wanted to leave you with. Thanks for listening. Okay.
Wow, you guys are real pros, so thank you. And Duncan, I'm sorry to disappoint, but never put a fisherman from Newfoundland in charge of logging and firewood. Chief, we owe you a debt of gratitude for all that you have done and all that you continue to do to advance First Nations issues. Your tireless advocacy and dedication to making a difference has brought positive change to First Nations communities across Canada, and we anticipate you'll continue to do so. As we look to Canada's next 150 years, we are encouraged that the spirit of cooperation and community is being used to reconcile past inequity and to right past wrongs. May the positive effects of reconciliation bring you great success in your ongoing work as National Chief. Thank you. And to you, Duncan, thanks for giving voice to the challenges facing First Nations people. We appreciate you using your journalistic expertise, both here today and to tell the stories that need to be told in important and passionate ways. Before we conclude, I want to extend another round of thanks to today's event sponsors, CIBC and Vice Rise. Thank you very much. Thanks. Thanks also to MediaEvents.ca, Canada's online event space, and VVC for live streaming today's event. To learn more about the club, please visit us at canadianclub.org. Thank you all for joining us. We look forward to seeing you again at another of our events. Have a great afternoon.